Hello, everybody. This is Gary Benoit with another episode of Beyond the Cover. And today we have with us Selwyn Duke, who wrote the article, Churches Burn in Canada, based on Blood-libel Myth. This appears in our issue for August 23 with the cover story, COVID Lies. Selwyn, we're glad to have you.
Gary, great to be with you, and I'm glad that your audience can finally see that I'm a real person and not just some artificial intelligence program that you conjured up to create articles.
Well, you're a very regular and very long-standing writer for the New American Magazine, so I bet people who are regular readers believe that they know you through your writings.
Yeah, and maybe a few radio interviews too, right?
That's right. But
and we sure know each other.
In this article that you did, Selwyn, in the August 23 issue, you talk about Canada, you talk about the church burnings in Canada, and even somebody who follows the news on a regular basis may be forgiven if he lives in the United States of America and is unfamiliar with these church burnings, because it really has not gotten any coverage here. So why don't you tell us what that's all about?
Yeah, it's very interesting. An editor I know up in Canada told me that she considered this, Gary, to be the biggest story in Canada. She said that a while back. And here's basically the situation. In 1883, they instituted these so-called residential schools in Canada that were designed so that Indians in Canada could get an education. And churches, mostly Catholic, but some Protestant too, were running them. Well, anyway, they were in place for probably 100 years or so, and finally most or all of them were closed down. And now, of course, what we're hearing are these allegations that they seized Indian children forcibly from their parents and made them enter these schools, these institutions, and then they brutalized them horribly and abused them and even murdered some of them. That's the allegation. That's what the mainstream media would have us believe. And to try to buttress their case, Gary, they've pointed to these so-called mass graves at these residential schools. So it all sounds very, very damning, but the truth is, and I bet this will really surprise your audience, the mainstream media have completely misrepresented this story. I mean, first of all, let's just go on to the mass graves, the so-called mass graves. Well, they're not mass graves at all. What these are normal church cemeteries. Remember that churches typically, especially in rural areas, would have cemeteries associated with them. So these were normal church cemeteries in which it seems that people, even from the wider community, were buried. I mean, there was some Indian investigator, I don't recall his name. I think he was identified by a source as Laral, just with one name. But he said himself that it seemed that there were many people buried in the cemetery at Kamloops Residential School. That's one school that really has figured prominently in media reportage. And it wasn't just children buried there. And then what happened was, over time, these cemeteries were abandoned, as will happen. Nothing abnormal about that, nothing nefarious. But again, the media are portraying it as if these are mass graves and children were murdered. And of course, I could keep going. There's more that could be said about that. I don't know if you want to ask your second question now.
Well, I think really we're dealing with two different issues here, because one issue is the rationale or the pretext for the church burnings, and that's what you have addressed thus far. And we do want to go more into that. But let's assume that the pretext is true. I mean, let's assume that it's the way that the media paints it. And of course, the media in the United States has been talking about the rationale. They have been furthering these or advancing these allegations to make it sound like it's the killing fields of Canada. It's as if church officials are the Khmer Rouge and that they killed all these children during the first part of the 20th century, or even going back to the 1800s. That has gotten publicity, but what has not gotten publicity is the actual torching of Christian churches, particularly Catholic churches, that's happening today. How many churches have been burned to the ground? And even if these allegations are true, and of course you're saying they're not, and we know they're not, does that justify burning Catholic churches today?
No, no, and let's point out we're not just talking about Catholic churches, but they are mainly Catholic churches. At last count, Gary, 50 plus institutions were either vandalized or burned. And the reality is, of course, no, it wouldn't justify that because, to paraphrase Abraham Lincoln, or at least something that was attributed to him, if you look for the worst in someone or something, you're sure to find it. So you can always find a reason to hate, but we should point out that the rationale is not correct at all. Now, I just addressed the issue with the cemeteries, but there's a lot more to it than that. First of all, it has to be understood that the residential schools were established not by the Catholic Church or any church, in fact, but by the Canadian government. In 1883, John A. Macdonald, who was the first Prime Minister of Canada, Gary, was instrumental in creating them. And then the churches were recruited to run them. And there was nothing unusual about that because the fact of the matter is that churches at the time, that was part of their mandate to educate the young. They were the ones that were involved doing that. In fact, the Canadian government school system wasn't even instituted until the late 1800s. So they couldn't have been in that business. And as far as seizing Indian children goes, well, the fact is that was government policy. That was not church policy. The churches were just running the schools. And even so, it should be pointed out, Gary, that it seems to me that if Indian children were seized, and some were seized certainly for a period of time, it didn't go on forever because we have so many testimonials from American Indians or Canadian Indians, if you want to call them that, who were students at these residential schools. And some of them just give you glowing appraisals of their time there. One is this fellow who is a famous Cree playwright named Thompson Highway. He said that he spent the best 10 years of his life, I think it was 10 years or 9, at the school that he went to. And he was very upset with how things were being mischaracterized in the media. He said, you know, they don't talk about all the joy at that school. They just talk about the bad things. And he said that were it not for his time at that school, he wouldn't be the successful man that he is today. He learned not just how to speak English, but he learned about so many other things, Western culture, the things that allowed him to become the playwright that he is today. And he's not the only one, Gary. There's also this woman who was the first female tribal chief in her area. Her name was C.C. Hodgson Macaulay, and she echoed Highway. She said that her years at her residential school were, again, some of the best of her life. She didn't know where this was coming from, all of these allegations. She said that her family, her sisters, would all say the same things. I mean, she talked about how the boys would play baseball games and they'd have sleigh rides during the winter, and she talked about other activities they engaged in. In fact, with the way she described it, it almost sounded like a Shangri-La. And she lived to a ripe old age. She just died in 2018 of cancer. I think she was maybe 95, something like that. But, you know, certainly, look, there was abuse. There's no doubt about that. As I pointed out in my article, Gary, anytime you have a big system in which you have adults and children, unfortunately, you're going to have some abuse. We saw that with the Boy Scouts, for instance. We see it with the governmental school system. But does that typify what went on at these residential schools? I really don't think so. And I'll point out something else. Some people may not want to hear this, but that Hodgson Macaulay, she also suggested that maybe some people who are coming out of the woodwork now and claiming abuse were lying in order to cash in on some kind of remuneration. Remember, there's $2 billion at stake here. I think that's being put up by the government. And this is not to imply, Gary, that all the people who are leveling accusations are lying. Not at all. That would be irrational to say. But when you have $2 billion at stake, it also would be irrational to say that no one would be lying. Because you know, you dangle that carrot, you know what's going to happen. There are some unethical, unsavory people who are going to crawl out of the woodwork and they're going to say, hey, all I have to do is make a claim that something happened to me and I can cash in. So it's a very, very complex issue. But the fact is these schools did a lot of good. That's very, very plain. Let's also point out something else, because I don't just want to put the onus on the government here. You know, I mentioned that it was the government that instituted these schools. It does seem that a lot of the people who were involved in this endeavor anyway really did have good intentions. They had the attitude, John A. Macdonald did, the fellow I mentioned earlier, who was Canada's first prime minister. He was a friend of the Indians in many ways, but he also believed that their culture was doomed to extinction. And that attitude was shared by many Canadians at the time. And they basically believed, the people who were sincere, that if they wanted these Indian individuals to survive as individuals, they had to bring them in to modernity. They had to educate them. They had to allow them to function in modern society. You might like that, you might not, but it seems pretty reasonable to me, that attitude. And nonetheless, that's what we all have to do. I mean, if we want to succeed in this society, we all have to get educated and embrace its norms. But there's just so much that we could say about this. I mean, here's another thing that I'll mention. You know, we talk about this media reportage, how biased it is. Let me put this in perspective for you. Okay, now I'm not talking about the Canadian scandal, but the American Catholic Church scandal that we all heard so much about for many years, the child sex abuse scandal. How was that exaggerated and mischaracterized? Well, roll this around in your mind a bit. There was this college professor, Carol Shakeshaft from Hofstra University. She conducted a government-funded study, was issued in 2004, and she contrasted the sex abuse in the Catholic Church and its schools with that in the governmental schools in the United States here. You know what she said? She said that the sex abuse of children in the governmental schools was 100 times the magnitude of that in the churches. Okay, 100 times the magnitude and still ongoing. And in the churches, in fact, the Catholic Church, most of the cases that we heard about were from prior to 1990, I understand, because the church had addressed the issue. Yet despite this, listen to this. During, I think it was the first half of 2002, Gary, the 61 largest newspapers in California ran 2,000 articles about the Catholic Church scandal. And how many do you think about the government church scandal? Four. 2,000 to 4. What does that tell you? Obviously, there is an agenda at work, and we see the same agenda with respect to what's going on up in Canada, don't we?
Yes, we certainly do. But regarding Canada, that agenda, that false narrative that you just refuted, has culminated in dozens of churches, dozens of Christian churches being burnt to the ground. Do you see the same thing happen in the United States at some point if present trends continue?
Well, sure. I mean, obviously, you just have to look at the cultural trajectory. If we continue on this trajectory where they're ratcheting up the anti-Christian hate more and more, well, it's obvious what lies down the road. There will be some catalyst for it, like the story up in Canada. They just need some excuse to hate, as I said earlier. And, you know, there was actually one other thing I wanted to mention, and now it's escaping me.
No, that does happen. But I know
Yeah.
in Canada, part of the catalyst has been the fact that politicians, including even the prime minister, have not condemned the burning of churches. Do you see it
That
getting
was
so
it.
bad? Do you see it getting so bad in this country that American politicians, people on the radical left, may not condemn the burning of Christian churches if that were to start happening here? Because certainly that encourages more burnings.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, that was exactly what I wanted to mention, Gary. Thank you very much. No, there's no doubt about it. And let's point out what's going on up in Canada. We've actually had public officials and public figures who've been encouraging the attacks on the churches. There's this one woman who's a civil libertarian and an immigrant to boot. Harsha Walia is her name, and she actually sent out on social media a message that stated, "Burn it all down." There was a talk show host who went even further. She said, "Burn it all down, seize all the wealth that the churches have, blah, blah, blah." It's a real mob mentality. And Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, it took him a week to come out and say anything about this. And when he finally did issue a statement, it was very, very plain vanilla, very mild, like, well, it's really not a good thing to do because maybe some people do derive comfort through the church, blah, blah, blah. I mean, it's absolutely unbelievable, the double standard. If this kind of violence were being visited upon mosques, you can just imagine what would happen, Gary. I mean, we know someone hangs a piece of bacon on the doorknob of a mosque and they make a federal case out of it. They want to level hate crimes charges. Here, oh, well, no big deal, nothing to see here, move along. It's hardly even reported.
Well, we're running out of time, Selma, but I do have one final question, and that is what can be done to rescue our culture?
Well, all we can really do is try to spread the truth and cultivate virtue in ourselves and in our children, because a virtuous people will be capable of sustaining a free society. A vice-ridden people will not be. There is no way that that's ever going to happen.
You think people can be virtuous without religion?
No, no, they can't be. They can't be. But since I see we have a little more time here, I'll just quote Irish Anglo or Anglo-Irish philosopher Edmund Burke. He said, "It is ordained in the eternal constitution of things that men of intemperate minds cannot be free. Their passions forge their fetters." And no, obviously, if you deviate from God, if you walk away from his ways, then what's going to happen is you're going to descend into moral relativism, moral nihilism, which we see happening all over the West. And then, of course, people are not going to be virtuous, because who's going to say what virtue even is? It's just going to be, well, we'll conclude that it's all just a matter of perspective, all just a point of view. And if everything just boils down to human preference like that, well, then why take pains to be virtuous? You might as well just do what feels right. And then, of course, you descend into hedonism, and hence we have that old saying, old now, if it feels good, do it. I mean, why do you think that's become a credo of modernity, a credo of the modern left? Because it's an outgrowth of the moral relativism, nihilism that I so often rail against.
So the solution is get back to truth, get back to God.
Yeah, get back to truth, get back to God. I often point out in my writings, Gary, that this moral relativism is the characteristic philosophical disease of our time. People don't talk enough about it. And it absolutely destroys civilization. I'll put it differently now, because if you conclude that everything is relative, then you can justify anything you may want to do. Rape, kill, steal, burn churches. Why not? Who's to say it's wrong? It's all just a matter of perspective. Look, I remember I read a college professor years ago who was lamenting the fact that students would come into his class and they couldn't even condemn Hitler and the Nazis, because their attitude was, well, I don't like what they did, but who am I to say what's right and wrong? And I thought to myself when I read that lamentation, well, professor, you and your fellow travelers have been pushing this ideology, this philosophy for a very, very long time now. And the students, you might say, have surpassed the teacher. They have taken your worldview to its logical conclusion. So don't be surprised. I mean, you're reaping what you've sown. And this is what I wanted to mention. You can stop me if we're out of time. But how bad is this philosophical disease of relativism in our society? Well, in 2002, there was a Barna Group study, that's a research company, and they found that back then, only 6% of teenagers believed in absolute truth. And even among adults back then, Gary, the dominant method for making so-called moral decisions was to do what felt right. And what have I been saying for so many years in my writings? When you don't have the truth as a yardstick to use to make moral decisions, when you're robbed of that, what do you have left to use? Well, the only thing you really have left are your feelings. And that's a big reason why we're so emotion oriented in this society. Again, if it feels good, do it. I mean, you'll notice, Gary, nowadays, a lot of people don't ask you, what do you think about that? No, they rather say, how do you feel about that? And that's not just a manner of speaking. It's something that really hints at their philosophical foundation, how they've been conditioned to think, that they've been conditioned to think in this emotion-oriented fashion. And again, stop me if I'm going on too long, but I told you this story. I mean, I'm digressing a bit, but it does relate to what we're talking about. I was talking to this fellow the other day who delivered something to my house, and I met him out on the sidewalk, beautiful sunny day, and he's wearing a mask. And I said to him, my man, you don't have to do that around me. I'm not worried. And he said, well, I think it's the right thing to do, blah, blah, blah. So what I did, Gary, was I confronted him with all the statistics and all the studies, the things that I've put in my articles. And the discussion was not contentious. He didn't get upset at all, and he didn't even disagree with my data. He couldn't refute it. But how did he conclude? He said, and this is close to a verbatim quotation, he said, I'm scared. The media has gotten us to do this, so I want to do my part and be a good citizen. And what was he saying in so many words? He was saying, Logic has nothing to do with this. Reason has nothing to do with it. It's all just emotion. This is what feels right, so I'm going with it. And passion governs, and she never governs wisely. I think it was Jefferson who said that, right? Or am I getting him mixed up with Franklin? I think it was Jefferson.
I'm not sure. But
Yeah.
we're out of time now, Selwyn.
We're out of
And
time, yeah.
yes, we really appreciate it. Thank you so much. But we encourage everybody to go to Selwyn Duke's article, Churches Burn in Canada. Here's what the article looks like right here in printed form. And to get the information, to follow the links, to be able to see that article, see the issue of the magazine where it appears, the August 23rd issue, and also to subscribe to the New American, see the description below this video. Thank you very much, Selwyn.